And over the last couple of months, I've been reading, you could say, an autobiography on the Apostle Paul. And I learned a lot about his personality. He was, of all the disciples, especially the disciples who followed Christ himself and knew Christ himself, I would say he was the best. He was the most intelligent, the most well-learned. He was the most fervent. He was theologically the most grounded. Many of them got confused at different times in their lives, but the Apostle Paul seemed to be the one who was at once the greatest enemy of the Lord, suddenly the greatest ally and greatest asset for the church, and really gives us a good depth of what we believe today because of him, because of the books that he has written. Just a couple weeks ago, we had a sermon about the 3 Hebrew worthies, how they stood before a king. Just last Sabbath, or 2 Sabbaths ago, Brother Alex preached that if you don't go to church, there's no way you'll be able to stand before a king. So there are important things that we got to put into our lives. And today I would like us to look at the Apostle Paul, because he stood before many kings in his life. Not only did he stand before kings, but he was able to be everything for everybody. Remember, he says in his writings, he says that for the Romans, he was a Roman. For Gentile, the Gentiles. For the Greeks, a Greek. For the Jews, he could be a Jew. He was one that could fit into everything. He would go to Athens there, and he would argue philosophy with the philosophers. Then he could speak Judaism with the Jews. Just about anything and everything he was well learned in. And on top of that, he even spoke hard words to his own fellow disciples, because there was controversy in the church. There was controversy on circumcision, and the Jews wanted to force the Gentiles to live a certain way, and Paul would openly, to the face of Peter, rebuke him and tell him that, you know what, you are not living according to your own visions that you had about the unclean animals coming out of the sky and how we should accept them. So he was a fervent man who was not afraid to get into a verbal fight. He was a preacher. He could cover any span, whether political, philosophical, or religious-wise, and have a good, strong argument. And that is what got him to stand before kings. And this was predicted by Christ himself. Just a little context for Acts 9:15 here. This is Ananias, and he's speaking with the Lord. And this is soon after Paul meets the Lord on the way to Damascus. So the Lord comes to Ananias and he says, you know what, there is a man, he's coming to see you. I'm sending him his way. His name is Saul. And Ananias answers the Lord and says, I have heard many things about this man, how much evil he hath done to my saints, to thy saints in Jerusalem. And here he hath authority from the chief of priests to bind all that call on my name, on thy name. But the Lord said unto him, go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel, for I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake. So Saul, now known as Paul, he's a vessel for the Lord. He has a purpose for the Lord. Do you want to have a purpose for the Lord? Do you want to be his vessel? Because Saul, now known as Paul, acted according to the Lord's desires, he did great things. And we, too, can do great things. This is just the start of Paul's career. Going to the street called Straight, changing his ways, going into the desert, into the Arabian desert, I believe, for several years, and then starting his ministry. I'm going to now fast forward till near the end of his ministry. He would still have many years to preach, but it would be in a different fashion. He would preach in chains. And we're going to be going to Acts 24 and just focus on the last couple chapters there of Acts. And what precedes this is Paul leaves the Gentiles. He comes back to Jerusalem with a sum of money that he wants to give to the Jerusalem church. And it was like offerings that were collected from the churches around the Gentile world. And Paul comes back, and since he has been the subject of so much controversy, even among his own church members in Israel, in Judea, Some of the brethren, including James and Peter and all those people, they say, Paul, you don't look like a good enough Jew. You should go into the temple and have a cleansing ceremony so you look more Jewish for us. And Paul, being the man who is everything for everybody, maybe that was his greatest flaw. He wants to bring unification. He agrees and he goes to the temple. And what happens in the temple? Some of the enemies from some of the other surrounding areas who remember him, who remember them stealing away all of the people from their synagogues and bringing them over to the Christian church, they see him, and they see him with two other men, and they accuse him of bringing Gentiles into the temple. Immediately there's a riot. Paul is attacked. He's about killed, but the Romans have to intervene and take him away. The Roman tribune there tries to figure out what's going on. These Jews are crazy. They're screaming and yelling. He realized that this is a theologic problem. This is not a Roman problem. There's no laws broken. So eventually, he decides to send him over to Caesarea, which is you could say, the capital of Judea at that time, where the Roman governor rules. So that's what happens with Paul. First, they're going to take him out publicly, but one of his relatives, I believe it's his nephew, realizes the Jews are planning to have him assassinated on the way to Caesarea. So the Romans send him out at night with a whole armed guard, and they send him to the capital where Felix was ruling. I won't go too much into what happens with Felix, but as soon as he gets there, the Jews send a delegation over to Felix, and they accuse Paul. They accuse Paul of all sorts of things. Felix is tempted to send him back to Israel because he doesn't want to deal with it, but in the end, he has a discussion with Paul. And let's turn to Acts 24, and we'll start off with 22 and 23. Today I'll be reading from the New King James. Many of you will be the King James, so we'll have a little bit of, see how the little changes in flavor and how the word of the Lord is given to us. When Felix heard these things, having a more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the proceedings and said, "When Lysias the commander comes down, I will make a decision in your case." So he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and hold him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for him or visit him. So Felix doesn't want to deal with this, and he wants another person to come and deal with this problem. And it's interesting because it says here that Felix has a knowledge of the way. He already has a background knowledge. He has an understanding. He has an understanding of Christianity. That's what it was initially called, was the way of Jesus of Nazareth. Who is Felix? He is a pretty amazing man. Once a slave, he became a freed man. And through conquests and leading in the army and then the military, he rose in rank and stature, and eventually he was appointed by the Caesar as governor of Judea. He was known as highly corrupt, very corrupt individual. Josephus speaks very lowly of him. He would kind of run a mini mafia. So what he would do is he would allow people to run their mafias in their different districts, and he would allow them safekeeping and protection of the law as long as he got a cut of the profits. So Felix was a businessman. Everything was about the money. Additionally, Felix was married to a Jewess. Her name was Drusilla, and we're going to learn more about her in the next slide. Drusilla is the second wife of Felix. She was originally married to another king who actually was a proselyte, which means he was a convert to Judaism. So she was a Jew, and she was married to a convert of a Jew. And she was a very, very beautiful woman. Her father was Herod Agrippa I. Her brother was Herod Agrippa II. So these are all Jewish kings. You're familiar with Herod during the time of Christ and Peter and in this time. Her sister was Bernice. And she was probably around 6 years of age when Herod Agrippa I executed James, when he had James killed. This is the same Herod that arrests Peter. This is the same Herod that runs all his guards through after Peter is escaped from jail because of the angel. The same Herod. So she remembers probably the execution of James, the disciple. So Felix is in love with this woman. And what does he do? He hires a magician called Simon. Now I wonder, and I didn't have the chance to look into this, is this the same Simon that is earlier in the Bible, Simon Magus, where Peter says, your riches perish with you? Because he wants to buy power. He wants to, he's already well known as a magician, and he wants something that the disciples have. It may very well be the same one. Anyway, he hires Simon to go and quote-unquote bewitch Drusilla and ruin the marriage. And Drusilla comes over and marries Felix, the leader of Caesarea and Judea at that time. She was likely around 22 years of age when she met Paul for the first time. So we'll continue on a little bit further. Acts 24, 24 through 26. So we context, Felix has left Paul in prison. He's waiting for somebody else to deal with the problem. But he's a very interesting guy. Him and his wife, his new wife Drusilla, they want to learn a little bit more. This guy is an interesting guy. Felix understands what the way is. He has an idea of what the way is or Christianity is at that time. So he says that after some days when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was a Jewess, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Now, as he, being Paul, reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered. In the King James, it says Felix trembled. Other translations, he was terrified. What did Paul talk to Felix about? Righteousness, self-control, and judgment. I can see that this touched the heart of Felix. He had a lot of guilt. He had a lot of corruption. He lived a life that was not proper. He had stolen someone else's wife. This is something that hit that couple very, very hard. And it says in the Bible that he trembled. Felix was afraid and answered, "Go your way for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you." So, convenient time. My question and my wish and prayer for us today is not to learn how only to speak to kings and to aspire to be like Paul, but also to understand that the defense mechanisms that we have in our lives, and we'll look at the three kings here, the three defense mechanisms that they have in their life that allows them to be lost. When I have a convenient time. Very good commentary here I got from Pulpit Commentary. It says here, Felix trembled. His agitation should have passed at once into resolution. He should have at once said, I will return on my way. I will turn my back on my old sins. I will be a new man, living a new life. But he did not. He made terms with his old self. He temporized. He played his opportunity. He resorted to evasion, to self-deception. He excused himself and said, "Go thy way. When I have time, I will call for thee." O well-worn, much-trodden path of self-excuse, along whose pleasant way such thousands of travelers have gone on their ruin. This is how we commit spiritual suicide. We go to our own death. We do not say presumptuously, "I will not." We say feebly, falsely, but fatally, "I will soon." I will when. There are three strong reasons against the delay under religious conviction. One is it's a guilty thing. We blame our children when they hesitate or linger instead of rendering a prompt, unquestioning obedience to us when we give them a command. However, in so many times we act the exact same way. I will then means I will not now. It is rebelliousness of spirit put in the least flagrant form. It is still rebellion. It is still a state of sin. So that's the first point. The second point, it is a delusive thing. So we defer and we imagine that at some other time there will be a better, a more convenient opportunity. So we deceive ourselves into thinking that, maybe next week, maybe next month, maybe next year I'll be in a better position. But we fail to realize that does life ever become simpler? Did Felix ever have a simpler life? He made more connections, had more people he had to serve, more crime he had to hide, and in the end he became less and less likely to go the way that he had been convicted to go. He became more entangled. Number 3, it is a fatal thing when you ask for a convenient time and you procrastinate. If vice has slain its thousands and pride its thousands, surely procrastination has slain its tens of thousands. Man who is consciously and determinately refusing to serve God knows where he stands and what he is. He knows that he is a rebel against God and standing on perilous ground. So Felix, he was convicted. He was convicted of his sin. He realized what he was doing was wrong. He trembled. But what did he do? A very dangerous thing that I think many of us do every day. We just delayed a little bit. It's just for tomorrow, but tomorrow never comes. And when tomorrow does come, it becomes today, and we're a product of yesterday where we didn't make the choice. That's what happened with Felix. He was convicted. He had his chance. But he waited for a more convenient time. What is the conclusion of Felix? He keeps Paul in chains because he wants to please the Jews. But unfortunately, Felix had angered the Jews so much that when he came to the end of his term, they sent a delegation to Nero. And Nero was furious with him. And the only reason that Felix had his life saved is that his brother stood up for him in court. And Felix pretty much retired in disgrace, luckily with his life. But his legacy is known as a failure, as a criminal. And on top of all of that, because he waited for a convenient time, his life and his soul was lost. His wife, Drusilla, living that life of scandal, being brought over because she's so beautiful to become the wife of Felix, she has only one son whom she names Agrippa, like her father and her brother. And she perishes in the eruption at Mount Vesuvius, which I found very interesting. She is one of those bodies laying there that you can go look at in Pompeii, but eternally lost. She, as well, had conviction, I do believe. But you know what? When you're waiting for a better time never really comes than today. What is the result of this in Acts 24:27? Actually, before we go to 27, I just want to hit another thing, which I found very interesting. In 26, what does Felix do? So he says, "Go thy way. When I have a more convenient time, I'll call for you." What does he do? He calls for Paul many times. In fact, it says here that he converses with him, and many scholars believe this word for conversing means that they met all the time. They may have even been fairly familiar and well acquainted, even friendly in their interactions. But you know what? All those times he met Paul, it was never convenient. And in the end, he was just hoping for money. Felix was just hoping for a bribe to let him go. That's all. It says it in the Bible. That he approached this like he approached everything else in life. Does Paul have enough money so I can let him go? Otherwise, I don't want to make the Jews unhappy. Anyway, so Felix leaves in disgrace, and Paul stays in chains for 2 years. Then in Acts 25, 1 through 6, I'll just briefly paraphrase, a new governor comes to town. He moves into Caesarea. He has been appointed there by the Caesar. His name is Festus. Now, Festus knows what happened to Felix. It's all a big deal. You know, we talk about impeachment these days, all those sorts of things. There's been controversy all through time. So Festus comes and he realizes that, you know what, I don't want the Israelites, the Jewish people, to be bad-mouthing me like they did Felix. So I'm going to come and I'm going to start it right. It says within 3 days he shows up in Jerusalem. So he's already there to pander to the Jews. And while he's in Jerusalem, they say, you know, Festus, you have a criminal there, a criminal in Caesarea. His name is Paul. He's really bad. He's really dangerous. He should be put to death. And they demand that Festus brings Paul back to Jerusalem so they can have a tribunal there. Of course, they're planning on killing Paul on the way over. But Festus, being at least a Roman with some dignity, says, no, if this man has any problems, he should have a proper trial. Where he is at, you can send a delegation up. So much of Acts 25 is the Jewish people sending a delegation up to Festus and accusing Paul of all sorts of things. Festus knows that Paul is innocent, but he does not want to anger the Jews. Then there comes a time, well, before we talk about the time when he gets congratulated by the Jewish kings, king and queen, I'd like to just outline a little bit of the history of Festus. So he's viewed a lot more positively in comparison to Felix as a governor of Judea. So he's also Roman governor, the next one in line. He was less corrupt, though still very evil. And same problem as Felix, unwilling to let Paul have his freedom even though he knew that he was innocent. So he was always wanting to appeal to the Jews and appease the Jews so that when he goes back home to Rome, he has a good report following him, and maybe he can even get a promotion. Now what happens is Festus comes into office here. He comes back from Jerusalem after several days to Caesarea. Then Herod Agrippa and his wife Bernice come to congratulate him. So in this whole big confusing scheme, you have a Roman governor, and then you have puppet Jewish governors set up as well by Rome that rule a certain aspect of Judean society. Now, not to confuse things, Herod Agrippa II, he is the brother of Drusilla, who married Felix. And he has two other sisters. One is Bernice, and then a third sister, which is not in the Bible, and I don't remember her name. So 3 sisters and himself, all the sons of Agrippa I, the same Agrippa who killed James and arrested Peter. So Herod Agrippa is a puppet king of Rome. He rules in Judea. These Judean kings, they have not much power. Agrippa had the least of all his fathers. After his father, Agrippa I, died, the kingdom got split up to Herod Agrippa II's uncle, and then after his uncle died, he inherited much of the kingdom when it was given to him by the Caesar. He also lived a life of scandal, and I'll bring that up here next. Herod Agrippa comes with his sister Bernice to Caesarea to congratulate Festus. So Bernice also has a very colorful history. She was married to her uncle, who was king before Agrippa II, her brother, inherited the throne. After he dies, she becomes single and lived a very open and incestuous relationship with her brother, Agrippa II. So she has a very spotted history. Both of these are Jewish kings and queens. So they arrive, and we'll turn now to Acts 25. And we'll start reading here on verse 22. They arrive, and Festus says, you know, we have a gentleman here, and you are a Jewish king. You know how the Jews think. Let me tell you about him. And Agrippa says in 22, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. So the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp, and entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at Festus's command, Paul was brought in. Then it goes on to say here, Festus says, Paul has appealed to go to Rome, to speak before Nero. And in verse 26, I have nothing certain to write to my lord, being Nero, concerning him. Therefore I have brought him before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that you can examine what has taken place, and I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send you a prisoner and not specify the charges against him." So by his own admission, Festus has no charges to bring against Paul. And he wants help writing a report so he can give it to Nero so it doesn't look like a spurious or false report. Acts 26, 1 through 3. Then Agrippa said to Paul, "You are permitted to speak for yourself." So Paul stretched out his hand and answered, "I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning the things which I am accused of by the Jews, especially because you are an expert in all the customs and questions which you have to do with the Jews. Therefore, I beg you hear me patiently." Ellen White says in Gospel Workers, page 123 of Paul and his communication before the rulers, she says, "Look at Paul when brought before the rulers. His speech before Agrippa is an illustration of true courtesy as well as persuasive eloquence. The gospel does not encourage the formal politeness current with the world, but courtesy that springs from real kindness of the heart." Then Paul goes into his testimony. So I think it's very important. If we are to stand before kings, we need to have a testimony. Why are we there? What is the purpose? And if you look in, I'd love to read it all, but time does not permit me. But if you look at the testimony here in 26, chapter 26 that Paul has, he starts at the very beginning. He starts at the very beginning how he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was the best of the best, the most strict of the most strict sect of that group. He goes through his conversion experience and why he believes what he believes. My question for each and every one of us, including myself today, is, do I have a testimony? Amen. Do I have something that I can say of why I live the life I live? Because if we're putting things off and confused and we don't even have a testimony, I don't think that the Lord has anything for us to say. When brought to a trial, why do you live the life you live? Why do you do what you do? What are we going to say? We have to have a reason why we do what we do. And Paul had that reason, and he says it beautifully here. I encourage everyone the Sabbath afternoon after your lay ministry to read the testimony of Paul here. Another thing I want to bring up. Paul is very verbose. I told you he could talk with the philosophers. He could talk with the Pharisees. He could talk with anybody. Anybody and everybody. Has the difference between Paul in trial and Jesus in trial ever bothered you? What did Jesus say? King of kings, God of the universe, what did Jesus say? Nothing. What did Paul say? He argued. In fact, earlier in 23, what does he tell the chief priests? God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. That's Paul. He's a fighter. But Jesus opened not his mouth. And I wonder why the difference. Because Jesus is perfect. So you have human tendencies in Paul. But notice all the followers of Christ have something to answer. Because A, I think the Spirit of God is in them. And B, I believe they have a different mission. Christ's mission was not to evangelize the world, but it was to save the world. And all those after, it's to evangelize the world. So Paul, as predicted, as it's said in Matthew, like our key text, and also in Acts, Paul had a purpose. And that was to carry the gospel to the world and to be an influence. And therefore, he was not like a lamb before his slaughterers or shearers is dumb. But he had words to say. And we'll learn a little bit more about those words today. Let's fast forward through chapter 26. Verses 13 through 17, that talks about the conversion experience of Paul when he meets Christ on the road to Damascus. Then in 17, I'll pick up there. The purpose of Paul is, I will deliver you from the Jewish people as well as from the Gentiles to whom I now send you. Verse 18, to open their eyes in order to turn them from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness for sins and inheritance among those who are sanctified by me. Therefore, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision, but declared first to those in Damascus and in Jerusalem and throughout all the land of Judea, and then to the Gentiles, that they should repent, turn to God, and do works befitting of repentance. For these reasons the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me. Therefore I have obtained help from God. To this day I stand witnessing both to great and small, saying no other things than those which the prophets and Moses said would come, that the Christ would suffer, that he would be first to rise from the dead, and would proclaim light to the Jewish people and to the Gentiles. Next verse. Now, as he had thus made his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you are beside yourself. Much learning has driven you mad. This is the second defense mechanism. You're crazy. You're insane. Was Festus? That is verse 24. Acts 26:24. Second defense mechanism. Did Festus ever receive conviction? It was utter rejection. Just before that, he hears about how the prophets and Moses, all of their prophecy has been fulfilled, and that Jesus would suffer and die and be raised, and all of this to Festus is insanity. He says, Paul, you're crazy. You make no sense. And it goes along with 1 Corinthians 1:22 and 23. For the Jews demand a sign, the Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. To Festus, it was insanity. It made no sense, and he utterly rejected it. And to the Jews who were standing in the court that day, Christ was but a stumbling block. He was inconvenient. He's not something they wanted to mess with. And as we look here for the Jewish puppet king, Christ was also a stumbling block as well. How does Paul respond to Festus? I find this very interesting because, if someone told me in court that I'm insane and it was screaming and yelling at me, I probably would start responding to him in like manner and look as insane myself. But it says here, Paul says, I am not mad, most noble Festus, but speak the words of truth and reason. For the king before whom I also speak freely, who is Agrippa, knows these things, for I am convinced that none of these things escapes his attention, since this thing was not done in a corner. It wasn't done in secret. What has happened, the death of Christ, none of it's a secret. It's well known, especially to the king of Judea. Also very interesting in here, Paul's conversation turns immediately from Festus and he focuses directly on Agrippa. Paul is an expert at reading body language, and he realizes immediately that when one avenue is closed down for good, he will focus fully on the other avenue. And we don't have much said about this period of time. Ellen White has some great comments that we'll read through it, but I believe that Festus was probably, Herod Agrippa II was probably white as a sheet. He was probably riveted, just staring at Paul. And it was obvious to Paul that he had struck a chord in the heart of Herod Agrippa. Acts of the Apostles says that deeply affected, Agrippa, for a moment, lost sight of his surroundings and the dignity of his position. Conscious only of the truths which he had heard, seeing only the humble prisoner standing before him, as God's ambassador, he answered involuntarily, Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. Did the mind of Agrippa at these words revert to the past history of his family, or their fruitless efforts against him whom Paul was preaching? Did he think of his great-grandfather, Herod, and the massacre of the innocent children at Bethlehem? Or the great-uncle Antipas and the murder of John the Baptist? of his own father Agrippa I and the martyrdom of the Apostle James? Did he see the disasters which speedily befell these kings, all evidence of the displeasure of God in consequence of their crimes against his servants? Did the pomp and display of the day remind Agrippa of the time when his own father, a monarch more powerful than he, stood in that same city, attired in glittering robes, while the people shouted that he was a god? Had he forgotten how, even before the admiring shouts, he had died away? Vengeance, swift and terrible, had befallen the vainglorious king. Something of all this flitted across Agrippa's memory, but his vanity was then flattered by the brilliant scene before him, and the pride and self-importance banished all nobler thoughts. Sketches from the Life of Paul, page 55 and 56. I'm going to add a little bit more of a twist to Almost You Have Persuaded Me to Become a Christian. And in explaining this twist, I'm going to go through what an idiom is. Now, I did not really understand what idioms were till I met people who didn't speak my native language. For example, when I first met Alex and he started to learn English, or even Edgar, they would tell me things like, they would say sayings, they would say a joke. And in their native language, it rhymed, it made sense. But when he translated into my language, it made no sense at all. It's like, that's silly. In our language, we have idioms that people in our culture do not understand, people outside of our culture would not understand. And I kind of have a list up here. Like, drop me a line. Does that mean you drop a line on the ground? You know what I mean? If you read it figuratively, it makes, if you read it literally, it makes no sense. You have to have an understanding. Or the judge threw the book at her. So the judge took a book and threw it at somebody. And if you read that in the Bible, you wouldn't understand what they're talking about because you were not there. You were not there in that culture. It means only that the judge dealt that person a harsh sentence. Well, it turns out that the word almost in the Greek language was part of an idiomatic expression. And most people believe that this is what Agrippa was really trying to say. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe. And Agrippa said to Paul, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? And Paul said, whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains. Now, that bothered me because almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian, just that had sunk into my life. You know what I mean? But I think this idiomatic expression underlines the true character of what was really inside Agrippa II. It was not that he was convicted and like, oh, I just want to be a Christian. He was sneering at Paul. He was convicted, but in the end, he was disgusted because he's like, you really think you can convert me to Christianity with a few short words? That's really what he's saying. That's really what that expression means. It says here that most people who study the Greek language believe and have concluded that Agrippa spoke in irony as if to make light of Paul's serious appeal. His irony was a mask to conceal his real feelings. Like Agrippa, those who are under a deep conviction oftentimes speak and act out in a different way, particularly in the presence of unbelieving associates. That's from SDA Bible Commentary, Volume 6. Paul Kretzmann, who has done some research on this, he believes that Agrippa would not permit himself to yield, but retorted, but with little persuasion, thou wouldst fain make me a Christian? And on the word Christian, I'd like to add one more thing. In that time, to call someone a Christian would be like to give a racial slur here today. It was not a word of pride. In fact, they would go by, we are people of the way. But to call someone a Christian was like insulting them. So not only is he acting like he really wants to be a Christian, he's instead mocking Christianity. He wanted to indicate, whether in irony or cold indifference, that he simply could not be made a Christian as easily as all of that. What does Paul say? I hope to God that all who hear me this day will become a Christian. And according to that idiom, he says, long or short, meaning in the short-term argument, or maybe over years to come, my prayer is by God's grace that all people here will become a Christian. Reading this brings me to a question. Who was on trial that day? Paul? Jesus? I think everybody in that room was on trial. Paul was on trial before the kings of this land, but you know what? The kings there, all people in that room were on trial. And that was the sentence. They had their chance. They had their conviction, every one of them. Festus had his chance, he made his choice, and this was madness. Agrippa was convicted. He was convicted, he realized his sin, but he lashed out because he would not be brought down to this strange Christian sect. And if you look at Felix, he also had conviction. In the courtroom, it was not only Paul on trial, but it was those kings there that day. So we have the gospel presented to people. On their respective pictures, I have stars on those who were convicted of their sins. At the top you have Felix. He has a star on his little picture. He was convicted of his sins, but he just put it off. He procrastinated. You have Festus, no conviction, no understanding, immediately shut it down. And then you have Agrippa, the second. He was convicted, but in the end, he just spewed forth venom, was not interested at all. These are three responses that we ourselves can have today to the gospel. I feel that for me, myself, and probably for most of us in this room, being professed people of the way or Christianity or SDARM or all these things, is, you know what? It's so easy to procrastinate. I think that's the most dangerous for us today. But the three responses that kings of that time had to the gospel that Paul brought before them. What was the conclusion of Festus? He only served 2 years in Judea and he died in office. Not much else is known about him. Unfortunately, from what we know of him, he was lost. He was totally lost. Herod, the last of the Herodic dynasty, he had a sad reign. He lived the longest reign of all of his fathers, uncles, but it was the weakest reign. His reign was tainted by problems between him and the Jews. He built a wall up above the Temple Mount, which spurned the Jews because nothing should be higher than the temple. On top of that, in AD 66 through AD 70, the Jews started to revolt. Herod went down to Alexandria doing whatever he was doing. And when he was gone, the Roman troops went into the temple and defiled it, and they just took articles, took the money, and left. And when he came back, he defended them. And he said, Rome is the greatest country. We need to be their friends. He defended the enemy. Then on top of that, his buddy, Vespasian and Titus, when the Jews truly revolted, they came into town to destroy Jerusalem. And Herod Agrippa used his own military to support the Romans. So the king of the Jews supported the attack and the destruction of Jerusalem. So that is what he is known by today. He lived to be a ripe old age into AD 100, but lived a lackluster life. And we know that because of what we have read here, he also is lost. Then Bernice. Interesting Bernice. She was too sick for both the Jews and the Romans. So incest with her brother. After all of this gets out, she tries to marry somebody else. But that falls apart. Eventually, Bernice finds herself in Rome. And she gets into a relationship with the new Roman Caesar, Titus. And the Roman Senate is so disgusted with her, they kick her out of town and they say, Titus, you can't have a woman like this in your palace. You can't have a relationship with her. And they kicked her out. Even the pagans couldn't handle this Jewish princess. So she went back to Agrippa and lived a life of sorrow and loss. So all of these people all had their chance, but all of them squandered it. So my question for us today is, what will be our response to the gospel? So not only are we learning how can we convey how the Lord has led us when we are on trial, but how are we responding to the gospel today? We can either procrastinate, we can call it insanity, or we can be convicted and in the end mock it and deride it. Ellen White says in Christ Object Lessons, page 117, they did not die to self that Christ may live in them. Therefore, they do not find the precious pearl. They have not overcome unholy ambition and their love for worldly attractions. They do not take up the cross and follow Christ in the path of self-denial and sacrifice. Almost Christians, yet not fully Christians. They seem near the kingdom of heaven, but they cannot enter there. Almost but not wholly saved means to be not almost but wholly lost. So my prayer for us today is that we not be the almost Christians. And then when we are faced with the gospel in our daily lives and the changes that we need to make, instead of going to the right here and procrastinating, instead of mocking it, that we may go the other direction and we may embrace it and then have our burdens lifted at Calvary. Because if any of those men or women may have done that, their life would have been very different. Yes, they may have ended up in chains like Paul, but in the end, in the great courtroom, in the great trial that is set for every one of us, they would have had their burdens removed and their sins forgiven. So my prayer for us is that we may be able to stand before God and kings.